speechless at this moment, but I came prepared. There are so many things that I can tell you about Tim that I was afraid that I would forget them. His accomplishments at Pine Crest are, I think probably are hard to believe. Starting with state speech champion, state teenage Republican of the year, chairman of the ICI Teen Board of Advisors, president of the National Forensics Association, head of the Naaman delegation, sophomore class president, all-state honorable mention all-state football. He has been inducted into our founder's Arete Society. He's in our Pine Crest Athletic Hall of Fame, and the list goes on. If you check the yearbook for 1979, Tim was voted most likely to succeed, and he has. He's a graduate of Princeton, a member of the class of '83, where he was the mass chairman. At Columbia, he was the senior editor of the Law Review. And now he's here. He's come home to speak to you about a very sensitive subject. I know he's going to talk from the heart, and I know that he has great concerns that he wants to share with you. And there's really nothing more that I can say that Tim won't be able to show you with his presence. So I want to present Tim McGinty.
I had my first sexual experience during my senior year at Pine Crest, and I continued to be sexually active while at Princeton, although in most of those experiences, I lied about my true name. I did not, however, even hear of the term AIDS until my first year of law school, when I quote-unquote came out, which for me meant getting involved in gay organizations. As soon as I did so, I discovered that people had, for some time, been discussing a mysterious epidemic, which, though it yet to make page 1 of USA Today, had, nevertheless, managed to kill thousands of people. Over the course of the next year, I moved first to limit the number of my sexual contacts, and then to practice only safer sex, and finally, only safe sex. Unfortunately, by then it was too late for me. I'll never forget the August morning in 1987, shortly after my graduation from law school, when the doctor first told me that I had tested positive for the AIDS virus. At first, I was just numb. It was as if nothing had registered. Then, when he was done, I walked across the street to where my father was waiting. He was at a diner having breakfast. Bacon and eggs, I believe. I told him what had happened, and we sat for a minute. And then I asked to leave, because I didn't want to cry in public. But I knew enough about the disease at that point to realize that a positive test result did not mean that my life was over. I had my parents by me, I had my friends, and I had Stephen, and the man with whom I share my life, and with whom just last week I celebrated my 4th anniversary. who had chosen to stand by me and continue our relationship despite the fact that he is HIV negative, which means that he's never been exposed to the AIDS virus. In addition, I also realized by that point in time that the AIDS virus is capable of remaining dormant in your body for an extraordinarily long period of time, and therefore, it might be years before I actually began to get sick. And so, I returned to New York and threw myself into the 12 and 14-hour days that constitute the norm of the New York legal practice, hoping all the while to remain symptom-free long enough to give science an opportunity to make some progress with the disease. Unfortunately, it was less than a year later when the first symptoms began to appear. First, there were the white infections in my mouth. And then the horrendous night sweats began. I'd wake up in the middle of the night with my sheets and pillows soaking wet, and with my hair feeling like I had just stepped out of the shower. It was around that time that the doctors first told me that my immune system had essentially collapsed. It had fallen by more than 95% in less than 2 months. At first, he was convinced that it must be some sort of lab error, but it wasn't. And so I arranged to take a leave of absence from work. And the combination of rest and my new medications seemed to be making a difference. It was at that time that I was first asked to deliver this assembly more than a year ago. They were having a special celebration over homecoming, commemorating the 10th anniversary of the undefeated football teams on which I had played here. And I had intended to stay over until the next Monday to make this presentation. Unfortunately, I never made it down. Last October, I began to develop some severe abdominal pains and was briefly hospitalized. And then, on November 2nd, I passed out in my doctor's office and was rushed to NYU Hospital, where I would proceed to spend the most painful month of my life. The doctors determined that an opportunistic virus had created a perforation or hole in my upper intestine, which would require emergency surgery. Then, later in the month, I suffered a severe drug reaction to my medications, which only compounded the difficulties. There were a few bright spots. I'll never forget coming out from underneath the anesthesia and realizing that my parents had made it up to New York from South Florida before the doctors had finished surgery. I'll never forget the looks on the nurses' faces as day after day I received 10 and 14 visitors. And I'll never forget one other experience that month. At one point, the doctor determined that he needed additional x-rays and arranged to have me sent down to another floor in order to have them taken. When the orderly arrived, I noticed that she was wearing plastic gloves. I had heard of incidents at other hospitals where the staff had taken hysterical and unnecessary precautions when dealing with AIDS patients, treating them as if they were some sort of lepers. But I'd yet to experience anything like that at NYU. But what was remarkable about this story is what happened when we reached the elevators. The door opened, and coincidentally, out stepped a supervisor who took one look at the orderly's hands, planted her feet, and demanded to know why she was wearing gloves. When the orderly began to hem and haw, The supervisor insisted that she remove them immediately. I can't tell you how much that simple act of being treated as a human being meant to me. But of course, any bright spots were far overshadowed, especially by the tremendous fear which gripped me during that month. I was filled with both pain medications and sleeping pills. But nevertheless, I would lie awake night after night, obsessed with fear. Fear of pain, fear of getting sicker, and fear of death. It's interesting that so many AIDS patients, the most terrifying of these is the fear of getting sicker. AIDS often involves a very slow death with a lot of dependency and a lot of degradation. Some AIDS patients seem to literally waste away. Others lose their sight, and still others undergo a rare form of dementia and essentially lose their very self. Clearly, for me, that is the most terrifying thought. And it's one I had to come to grips with this summer, along with the other members of my AIDS support group, which is a small group of people with AIDS that meet with a counselor each week to discuss what's going on in our lives. And we watched this summer as one of our members slowly deteriorated, both physically and mentally. In the end, or eventually, he stopped showing up at all, which we later realized meant that he had given up fighting. And in the end, he stopped taking his medication in the hopes of dying sooner, with some shred of dignity left. It was a decision that only a few years ago would have made no sense to me. But last fall, lying in a hospital bed, barely able to roll over from one side to another, it made a lot of sense. But it was a decision which, for me, was still a long ways off. A perforated intestine is a tremendously painful experience, and no one who has endured it has ever looked at a bowl of chili the same way. But with modern technology and proper medical care, is unlikely to be fatal. And so, in the month following my release from the hospital, my body was on the mend. My spirits, however, were not. It seemed as if my entire life had been turned upside down. As if all of my dreams had been so thoroughly shattered that they could never be put back together again. It even began to seem as if the challenges involved in surviving AIDS were more terrifying than not surviving AIDS. And I would lie in my bed and pray to God that I would get sicker and die soon. Eventually, I even began to consider suicide. Fortunately, I didn't do so in silence. I reached out to the people around me, to my parents, to Stephen, and to a counselor. In the end, it was Stephen who put these thoughts to rest by screaming at me in a fit of rage that he didn't give a blankety blank whether or not I thought my life was worth living. That all he knew was that, miserable or not, he wanted me to go on being a part of his. That was the low point of my life. And I've come back a long ways since then, both physically and emotionally. I'm back to working, at least part-time, along with the support of my law firm, which has essentially created a position mainly to fit my needs. I'm back to going to the gym, and I'm back to talking about living to see the day when AIDS can cease to be a fatal disease and can start to become only a chronic one. A lot of factors have contributed in helping to get me through this far, 3 of which I think deserve special mention. The first is that I finally managed to begin to learn how to live one day at a time, which isn't easy for me. As a former teenage Republican who has spent most of his life preparing for a career and for a future that he may never have a chance to live. I find that it's important to focus not on all of the ominous drama that the future may hold for me, but rather only on the individual day that I've been given. I find that when I do so, I am not only able to endure them, but I can live each one with a sense of joy and gratitude. The second factor that has helped getting me through this far has been the strength of my support network. It's somewhat ironic that I would be standing here today talking about the importance of emotional support, since the last time I stood on this stage was at my high school graduation, where I delivered an oration concerning the importance of emotional intimacy. And I realize now, in retrospect, that the reason I selected that topic was because I, like so many teenagers, felt so alone. In my case, the situation was compounded by the fact that I was struggling at the time with my sexuality. And while the experts insist that 10% of the world's population is gay, it certainly didn't seem that way in high school. In fact, it seemed like I was the only person alive to have ever gone through such a struggle. And as a result, I sincerely believed that there wasn't a person in the world to whom I could fully open up. What the AIDS crisis has taught me, more than anything else, is how to reach out and ask for the support that I need to survive. And that wasn't easy for me, both because I have a tremendous fear of rejection, and, well, because it's never easy to make yourself that vulnerable to another human being. What I found when I did so was that my support network was already far stronger than I had realized. Stronger than I dared imagine. I had my parents, I had Stephen, I had Stephen's parents who treat me as one of their own. And I had tremendous legions of strong friends, both from the gay community and from work, from law school, from Princeton, and from Pine Crest, many of whom are here today, having stayed over from our class's 10th high school reunion in order to share this experience with me. And all of whom have made it clear that they will continue to be by my side throughout this crisis. Many AIDS patients have had similar positive experiences. I know you've probably all heard the horror stories about parents who have refused to visit their children with AIDS. And a lot of those are true. But there also have been many beautiful stories of reconciliation, of parents and children estranged from each other for years, who have reunited in the face of this crisis. Still, all in all, AIDS has been a disease of isolation. The stigma and hysteria that surrounds this epidemic is such that a lot of people are afraid to reach out. I've even heard of a priest up in the Bronx who, when he began to recognize the symptoms of AIDS in himself, not only refused to reach out to his family and his friends, but refused even to seek medical help for fear that someone would find out. It wasn't until he lay on his deathbed and realized that he needed to receive last rites that he was finally forced to open up to someone. When I heard that, I realized that I was one of the lucky ones, and that I have a lot to be thankful for in terms of my support. And I can only hope and pray that if I survive this ordeal, I'm given the opportunity to give back to others as much love and concern as has been given me. A third and final factor that deserves special mention in getting me through this far is the support I received from Dignity, which is the organization of gay Catholics. While I'm involved in a whole host of gay professional, alumni, and AIDS-related organizations, the most important to me over the last couple of years has been Dignity. Since I've always been both a deeply religious person and a gay person, it's not surprising that I've spent most of my life involved in some very difficult religious struggles. And coming down with AIDS has, for me, as for so many other AIDS patients, both resurrected a lot of these questions and presented me with new ones And I couldn't have dealt with either of those had it not been for the support of a strong faith community. And just as importantly, Dignity is now beginning through its AIDS ministry to give me an opportunity to put something back by working with and ministering to other people with AIDS. And that's important because I've realized that this disease seems most frightening to me and most overpowering when I sit alone in my room and dwell on it. And I feel strongest and most able to face the future when I'm out there helping someone else through it. Everyone I spoke to told me that the most effective way to make AIDS both more real to you and more human was for me to come back and tell my own story. I am concerned, however, that by having done so, I may have ended up reinforcing a misconception which a lot of people have, that AIDS is a gay disease. It is not a gay disease, or an HIV drug user's disease, or a hemophiliac's disease, or the property of any other single group. Anyone who chooses to engage in unsafe sex is at risk for catching AIDS. And there are few segments of our society in which more unsafe sex takes place than among teenagers. It was 2 years ago that the Surgeon General first predicted that teenagers could become the next high-risk community. For the last 2 years, experts have been sitting on a time bomb, praying that educational efforts would pay off before it went off. Unfortunately, very little real education has taken place. And just last month, the Center for Disease Control, which is the main governmental entity that monitors this epidemic, released the long-anticipated study, which indicates that those predictions are being borne out. In some high-risk communities, and Fort Lauderdale is a high-risk community, the rate of infection among teenagers is now as high as 1 in 100. And those figures are expected to grow exponentially over the next couple of years. In the last year alone, there's been an explosion in the rate. And perhaps most frightening to many of you is the fact that the bulk of that transmission has taken place through unsafe heterosexual intercourse. I realize that this must be difficult for a lot of you to comprehend. I mean, it's unlikely that any of you know a teenager who has died from AIDS. And most of the AIDS patients you see on TV are significantly older than you. Just as I remember that when I first heard about AIDS, it seemed like all those who were dying were much older than me. But what I didn't realize at the time is that the AIDS virus often takes up to 10 years before it begins to produce outward symptoms. And as a result, the teenagers who are infected today may not begin to get sick and die for another decade. But if you wait around until then,